The fluorescent lights of St. Jude's Memorial buzzed with that particular frequency designed by some sadistic engineer to drill directly into the human skull at 2 in the morning. The emergency room was a purgatory of bad coffee that had been sitting too long, exhausted nurses running on spite and caffeine, and the quiet, grinding despair of people who had nowhere else to go. The phone call had lasted barely 10 seconds. He hadn't asked him to come. He'd simply stated a fact, his voice thin and wrong in a way that made something cold settle in the base of Julian Cross's spine. 20 minutes later, the sliding double doors of the emergency entrance parted. Julian didn't bring his men. He didn't carry a weapon visible beneath his dark wool overcoat. He just brought a silence heavy enough to suffocate the fluorescent hum right out of the air. People in the waiting room looked up, then quickly looked away. There was something about the way he moved, that slow, deliberate predatory grace, that made instincts older than language scream danger. Julian Cross did not sleep. Sleep was a vulnerability, a temporary death he couldn't afford. At 2 in the morning, his penthouse office was a tomb of glass and steel overlooking the sprawl of Chicago. The city below was a grid of amber streetlights and moving shadows, a machine that never stopped grinding. He'd been sitting behind a desk of reclaimed mahogany, a ledger open in front of him, a glass of lukewarm rye whiskey resting near his knuckles. He wasn't a man given to excess. He wore a simple black button-down, sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the faded ink of a life he'd supposedly left behind. The violent, bloody machinery of the Cross Syndicate was buried deep beneath layers of LLCs and corporate tax filings. And the person who buried those bodies, figuratively speaking, was his secretary, Ethan Miller. He was not a man from Julian's world. He didn't grow up dodging bullets on the South Side, and he didn't have uncles who went to federal prison for racketeering. He was a Cornell graduate with a degree in accounting and a mind like a steel trap. 5 years ago, he'd walked into Julian's legitimate front company for an interview. 3 months in, he'd found the discrepancies in the books. Instead of going to the police, he'd walked into Julian's office, placed a corrected ledger on his desk, and told him his previous accountant was stealing from him. He'd saved Julian $2 million and a federal indictment. Julian had offered him a job on the spot, double the salary, unparalleled benefits, and one ironclad rule: you see everything. You fix the math, and you never ask where the cash comes from. Ethan had agreed. For 5 years, he'd been the only indispensable moving part in Julian's empire. He managed his schedule, laundered his capital, and stood as a firewall between him and the chaos of the streets. He was professional to a fault. Hair always neatly styled, suits always tailored but conservative. A quiet, unassuming force. But the private line on Julian's desk had rung at 2:07 a.m. It was a heavy black analog phone, not connected to a switchboard. Only 3 people had the number. 2 of them were currently running a port operation in Miami. The third was supposed to be asleep in his townhouse in Lincoln Park. Julian had stared at the ringing phone. A low, cold hum started in the base of his spine. He picked up the receiver. He didn't say hello. Mr. Cross. Ethan's voice. But it was wrong. The crisp, authoritative tone he used to command Julian's lieutenants was gone, replaced by something thin, brittle, like glass about to shatter. Ethan. Julian's voice was gravel, quiet and flat. I'm at St. Jude's Memorial. A harsh intake of breath rattled through the speaker. I apologize for calling this line. My cell phone was destroyed. I used the hospital phone. The police want to take a statement, and I didn't know who else to call. He didn't sound panicked. He sounded hollow. That was worse. St. Jude's, Julian repeated. I can take a cab home after they finish the stitches. I just needed to inform you I might be late for the 9 a.m. briefing. He was rambling. Shock. Stay. Julian hung up the phone. He didn't slam it. He placed it down with terrifying care. He didn't call his security detail. He didn't wake his enforcers. This wasn't a syndicate issue yet. This was his secretary, alone in a public triage center in the middle of the night. He grabbed his keys, threw on his overcoat, and took the private elevator down to the garage. The drive across the city was a blur of wet asphalt and red lights. He didn't stop for any of them. The rain had started, a miserable freezing drizzle that smeared the street lamps across his windshield. The engine of his Audi sedan growled as he pushed it 80 miles an hour down Michigan Avenue. His mind was a sterile tactical space. He cataloged the enemies who might want to send a message. The Russians in the North Ward. The remnants of the old Irish mobs. A disgruntled contractor. But no one went after Ethan. He was a civilian. In the intricate, brutal chess game of the Chicago underworld, you didn't touch the accountants. It was bad for business. It invited a kind of retaliation no one wanted to survive. If someone had pushed him deliberately, the rules were suspended. Julian pulled into the emergency drop-off zone at St. Jude's, leaving the car idling in a tow-away zone. He didn't care. The heat of the waiting room hit him first as he walked through the sliding automatic doors, followed by the smell, antiseptic, stale sweat, cheap coffee. The room was crowded with the night's casualties. A man nursing a broken hand, a mother holding a feverish child, a pair of cops leaning against a vending machine looking bored. Julian didn't rush. He didn't scan the room frantically. He walked with a heavy, measured gait directly toward the triage desk. People moved out of his way without realizing why. He had the kind of presence that commanded space, tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes as hard and unreadable as flint. The nurse behind the reinforced glass was typing away, looking exhausted. "Ethan Miller," Julian said. The nurse sighed, not looking up. "Family only past the double doors, sir. You'll have to wait until he's discharged." Julian didn't argue. He reached into his coat, pulled out a heavy platinum money clip, peeled off 5 crisp $100 bills, and slid them under the gap in the glass. The nurse stopped typing. She looked at the money, then up at Julian's face. Whatever she saw in his expression, the absolute, uncompromising deadliness in his jawline, made her swallow hard. "Bay 4, she whispered, sliding the money under a clipboard. Down the hall on the right. Julian walked past the security doors. He didn't look back. The ER floor was a chaotic symphony of beeping monitors, hushed voices, and the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum. Julian navigated the narrow corridors, his eyes tracking the bay numbers painted in faded blue on the walls. 1, 2, 3, 4. He stopped at the edge of the curtain. It was pulled back just enough to see inside. Ethan sat on the edge of the gurney. Julian's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. His usually immaculate appearance was gone. His cream-colored silk shirt was torn at the shoulder, stained with a mix of grease, street dirt, and dark dried blood. His left arm was strapped tightly against his chest in a temporary sling. But it was his face that made the cold hum in Julian's spine turn into a roaring inferno. A jagged laceration ran along his left temple, currently being stitched by a young resident. His cheekbone was swollen, blooming into a violent shade of purple and black. His eyes were dull, staring straight ahead at the white wall. He looked fragile. Ethan Miller, the man who had single-handedly shut down a multi-million-dollar money-laundering sting by finding a loophole in a warrant, looked like he could blow away in a stiff wind. 2 uniformed police officers stood at the foot of the bed, holding notepads. "Mr. Miller, we need you to focus," one of the cops was saying, his tone impatient. "You said a black SUV ran you off the road. Do you remember the make? A license plate?" Ethan blinked slowly. "I told you. It was dark. They didn't just run you off the road. They boxed my car in. 2 men got out." "And then what?" the cop pressed. "Did they ask for your purse? Your keys?" "They didn't ask for anything." Ethan's voice was trembling slightly. "They smashed the driver's side window with a bat. They dragged me out. One of them threw me against the hood." He hesitated, his eyes flickering. He said, "Tell your boss his books are closed." The officers exchanged a look. "Your boss? Who do you work for, Mr. Miller?" Julian stepped into the bay. He didn't announce himself. He simply occupied the space. The air in the small cubicle seemed to instantly drop 10 degrees. The 2 cops turned, hands instinctively drifting toward their utility belts at the sudden intrusion. The young doctor paused, needle hovering over Ethan's temple. Ethan's head snapped up. When his eyes found Julian, the dullness vanished. For a split second, a profound, gut-wrenching relief washed over his features, immediately followed by the ironclad mask of professionalism he always wore around Julian. "Mr. Cross." His voice was raspy. "You didn't have to come." Julian ignored the cops. He ignored the doctor. He walked straight to the side of the gurney. He looked down at Ethan. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't ask if he was okay. He obviously wasn't. Julian looked at the bruising on his jaw, the way his ribs hitched when he breathed. He cataloged every injury, filing it away not as a tragedy, but as a debt that would be collected. He reached out. His large, calloused hand hesitated for a fraction of a second before gently brushing a stray lock of blood-matted hair away from Ethan's uninjured eye. The touch was impossibly light. Ethan stopped breathing for a second. "Excuse me, buddy." The older cop barked, stepping forward. "This is an active police interview. You need to step back." "Who are you?" Julian slowly turned his head. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. "I'm the boss he was referring to. My name is Julian Cross. He is my chief financial officer. And this interview is over." The older cop scoffed, puffing his chest out. "Yeah, well, Mr. Cross, unless you're his lawyer, you don't dictate when we're done. We have an aggravated assault here. You have a mugging." Julian corrected smoothly, his voice a low, lethal baritone. "A random act of violence in a city plagued by it. Mr. Miller is in shock. He gave you what he remembers. You will file your report in the morning. Now, you are going to leave this cubicle so the doctor can finish his work, and then I am taking my employee home. Listen here." The cop started, pulling his radio. Julian stepped into the officer's personal space. He didn't make a sudden move. He just stood there, towering over the man. Julian's eyes locked onto the officer's badge number. "Officer Riley." Julian read the nameplate. He leaned in, lowering his voice so only the two cops could hear. "You work out of the 12th precinct. Your captain is Thomas Vargas. I had dinner with Tommy 2 nights ago at the Palmer house. We discussed the union pension fund. If you would like to continue harassing a traumatized man, I can call Tommy right now and we can discuss your pension. Or, you can take your notepad, walk out into the rain, and close this file." The silence that followed was heavy. Officer Riley swallowed. He recognized the name. More importantly, he recognized the man. You didn't work the streets of Chicago for more than 5 years without hearing whispers about Julian Cross, the man who owned half the real estate in the South Loop and supposedly commanded a small army of ghosts. Riley took a step back. He tapped his partner's arm. "We have what we need for the preliminary report. Have a good night, Mr. Miller." They left quickly, the curtains swinging shut behind them. The young resident doctor was sweating. I just need to finish these 3 stitches, sir." Julian nodded once. "Do it well." He stood by the gurney, his posture rigid. Ethan watched him. He knew him well enough to read the microscopic shifts in his demeanor, the rigid set of his shoulders, the cold, dead look in his eyes. He was furious. Not at Ethan. At the world that had dared to touch him. Ethan opened his mouth to apologize again, to explain how he'd been ambushed at the stoplight near his neighborhood. Julian met his gaze. He shook his head once, just a fraction of a millimeter. "Don't speak." The message was clear. There was no need for words. Words were cheap. Words were for people who needed explanations. Julian already understood everything that mattered. Ethan was hurt. Someone had hurt him. The rest was just logistics. "Done," the doctor said, snipping the thread. "He needs rest. Painkillers for the ribs. They're bruised, not broken. Keep the arm elevated. He should follow up with a primary care physician in a week." "He will," Julian said. "Can he walk?" "I can walk." Ethan interrupted, his pride flaring slightly. He shifted his legs off the side of the bed. His feet hit the linoleum, and a sharp spike of pain shot through his bruised ribs. He swayed, his knees buckling instantly. Before he could fall, Julian caught him. His arm wrapped around Ethan's waist, pulling him flush against his side. Julian was solid, unyielding, smelling of cedar wood, winter rain, and a faint trace of expensive whiskey. It was the closest Ethan had ever been to him in 5 years. The heat radiating off his body was shocking. "I've got you," Julian muttered. The first words he had spoken directly to Ethan since he entered the room. He didn't ask for a wheelchair. He simply supported most of Ethan's weight, tucking him against his side, and guided him out of the bay. The walk through the hospital corridors felt endless, but Ethan felt strangely untethered, floating on a wave of adrenaline and the dull ache of the painkillers the doctor had given him earlier. He leaned heavily into Julian. Julian adjusted his grip, his hand resting firmly on Ethan's hip, holding him upright with effortless strength. He didn't speak to the staff as they left. He didn't look at anyone. He moved with a singular purpose, cutting through the hospital like a shark through deep water. When the automatic doors slid open, the frigid Chicago wind slammed into them. Ethan shivered violently, his torn silk shirt offering zero protection. Julian stopped abruptly. Without a word, he let go of Ethan's waist with one hand, shrugged off his heavy wool overcoat, and draped it over Ethan's shoulders. It swamped his frame. It was thick and heavy, lined with silk, trapping Julian's body heat around him like a cocoon. "Mr. Cross," Ethan managed to say, his teeth chattering. "You'll freeze." "Walk," Julian commanded softly. He guided Ethan to the idling Audi. He opened the passenger door, helping him ease into the leather seat, making sure his injured arm wasn't bumped against the doorframe. He closed the door with a solid thunk, isolating Ethan in the quiet, heated interior of the car. A moment later, Julian slid into the driver's seat. He was in his shirt sleeves, the cold rain dampening his dark hair, but he didn't seem to notice the temperature. He threw the car into gear, and they pulled away from the curb. The silence inside the cabin was absolute. The only sound was the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers and the hum of the tires on wet asphalt. Ethan stared out the window, watching the blur of streetlights. The shock was beginning to wear off, leaving behind a cold, creeping terror. "Tell your boss his books are closed." He had always known who Julian Cross was. He wasn't naive. He knew the shell companies were fronts for gambling rings, protection rackets, and smuggling routes. But it had always been numbers on a screen to him. Abstract data. He balanced the ledgers. He filed the taxes. He kept the IRS away. He had never seen the blood. Tonight, the violence of Julian's world had reached out and grabbed him by the throat. He turned his head slowly to look at Julian. His profile was illuminated by the dashboard lights. Harsh, angular, merciless. His eyes were locked on the road, his grip on the leather steering wheel so tight his knuckles were bone white. "They were waiting for me," Ethan said. The silence was too loud. He needed to break it. Julian didn't look at him. "I know." It was a message. "I know, Mr. Cross." Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. "I can't go back to my townhouse. If they know my route, they know where I live. You're not going to your townhouse." Julian took a sharp right turn, heading away from Lincoln Park. He was driving toward the North Shore, toward his private estate. "I'm a liability now." The harsh truth of his corporate mind took over. "If they're targeting me to get to you, keeping me around makes you vulnerable. I have sufficient funds. I can relocate. I can resign." The tires screeched as Julian suddenly slammed on the brakes, pulling the heavy car to a halt on the shoulder of a deserted, rain-slicked road. The sudden stop threw Ethan forward against the seatbelt, making him gasp in pain. Julian threw the car into park. He turned to face him. His expression was a thundercloud. For a terrifying second, Ethan thought he had overstepped, that the ruthless Mafia boss had finally grown tired of his accountant. Julian unbuckled his seatbelt and leaned across the center console. He invaded Ethan's space, bringing his face inches from his. His dark eyes searched Ethan's battered face, tracing the line of the bandage on his temple, the bruise on his jaw. "Do not ever say that word to me again." His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying, vibrating intensity. "What word?" Ethan whispered. "Resign." Julian held his gaze, refusing to let him look away. "You don't resign, Ethan. You don't run. And you are not a liability. They used me to send a threat, Ethan argued weakly. And I will use them to send a massacre. Julian replied instantly, without a shred of hesitation. It wasn't a boast. It was a simple statement of fact. They touch what is mine. They breached the wall. What is mine? The words hung in the air between them, heavy and loaded. He didn't say my employee. He didn't say my secretary. Ethan stared at him, his breath catching in his throat. The cynical, calculated barrier he kept between them suddenly felt very fragile. He realized, looking into Julian's eyes, that his absolute silence in the hospital hadn't been indifference. It had been restraint. He was holding back a rage so profound it would have burned the building down. Julian slowly pulled back, retreating to his side of the car. He put the vehicle back in drive and pulled out onto the road. Dr. Orris is waiting at my compound, Julian said, his tone returning to a flat, businesslike calm. He has an X-ray machine and proper medical supplies. You will stay in the East Wing guest suite until I deem it safe for you to leave. And when will that be? Ethan asked softly. Julian looked at the road ahead, his eyes narrowing at the rain. When there is no one left alive who remembers your name. The rest of the drive passed in a profound, shifting silence. It was no longer the silence of an employer and his staff. It was something deeper, grounded in shared trauma and a dark, unspoken loyalty. They passed through the towering wrought iron gates of the Cross Estate 20 minutes later. Armed guards stepped out of the shadows, recognizing the vehicle and waving them through. The massive stone manor loomed in the darkness, isolated and impenetrable. Julian parked under the portico. He walked around, opening Ethan's door. This time, he didn't just support him. He slid one arm under Ethan's knees and the other behind his back, lifting him out of the car entirely. I can walk, Ethan protested weakly, though he didn't fight it. Shut up, Ethan, Julian murmured, carrying him up the stone steps. Inside the grand foyer, Dr. Orris, an older, discreet man who owed his medical license and his life to the Cross family, was waiting with a medical bag. Julian ignored him, carrying Ethan straight up the sweeping mahogany staircase to the East Wing. He brought him into a massive, opulent guest room, gently setting him down on the edge of the king-sized bed. He pulled his overcoat off Ethan's shoulders, careful of his arm. Orris will look at you now. Julian stepped back toward the door. Get some sleep. We'll talk business tomorrow. Julian. It was the first time in 5 years Ethan had used his first name. Julian stopped in the doorway, his hand on the brass knob. He looked back. Thank you, Ethan said. Julian didn't smile. He just nodded once. Sleep. He closed the door behind him. Julian stood in the empty hallway for a long time. He pulled a silver cigarette case from his pocket, lighting a cigarette. He took a long drag, letting the smoke fill his lungs, feeling the cold mechanical rhythm of his pulse. He pulled out his burner phone and dialed a number. It rang once. Boss. A gruff voice answered. Wake the boys up, Julian said, staring at the closed door of Ethan's room. We're going hunting. The rain turned to sleet by 4 in the morning. It hit the corrugated tin roof of the Southside Chop Shop like handfuls of gravel. Inside, the air tasted of motor oil, stale beer, and the distinct metallic tang of fear. Julian Cross stood in the center of the concrete floor. He still wore the damp dress shirt from the hospital, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows. He wasn't holding a weapon. He didn't need to. The 6 men surrounding the perimeter of the garage, his men, were armed heavily enough to take a small municipality. In front of Julian, kneeling in a puddle of hydraulic fluid, was a man named Ricky. Ricky was a mid-level contractor who specialized in stolen vehicles and intimidation. Behind him sat the scorched, stripped chassis of a black SUV. I'm going to ask you once, Julian said. His voice was a flat, conversational murmur that barely carried over the drumming sleet. Who paid for the rental? Ricky spat a mouthful of blood onto the concrete. His left eye was already swelling shut. Man, I told you. I just procure the rides. It was a blind drop. Cash in a duffel. I don't ask names. Julian looked at Carter, his lieutenant. Carter was a man built like a bank vault, with a face that looked like it had been reconstructed from memory. Carter nodded slowly, stepping forward with a heavy iron lug wrench. Wait. Ricky panicked, holding his hands up. I swear to God, Cross. It was a burner phone. A voice modulator. They just said they needed a heavy vehicle to box in a sedan on a residential route. And you didn't think to ask who the target was? Julian stated. Not my business. It became your business. Julian took a slow, measured step forward, his leather shoes crunching on the grit of the garage floor. You provided the cage they used to trap a man who balances my books. You facilitated a breach of my perimeter. You think cash in a duffel absolves you of the logistics. Julian crouched down, now eye level with the kneeling man. He didn't yell. He didn't snarl. He spoke with the chilling patience of a teacher explaining a fatal math error. The man you leased that car to put a baseball bat through a window. They put hands on my employee. They bruised his ribs and split his temple. Julian tilted his head. I'm going to take my time dismantling the people who ordered it. But I need a thread to pull. Give me the thread, Ricky. Ricky's breath hitched. He looked at the cold, dead certainty in Julian's eyes and realized there was no negotiation. The drop, he stammered. The cash drop for the SUV. The bills were wrapped in old casino bands. The Royal Crown in Hammond. Julian stood up slowly. The Royal Crown. An old gambling boat managed by the O'Bannon family. Irish remnants who'd been bleeding territory for a decade. Carter, Julian said, turning his back on the kneeling man. Yeah, boss. Burn the chassis. Break his hands. If he touches a steering wheel in this city again, bury him. Julian walked out into the freezing sleet. He didn't look back to watch. He pulled out his phone, dialed a number, and waited. The vile violence was just a ledger balancing. A transaction of pain for pain. Now he had the account number. Miles away, on the North Shore estate. Ethan woke to the sterile scent of medical gauze and the deep, rich smell of old wood. He opened his eyes, immediately regretting it. The room spun, a dull throb radiating from his left temple to the base of his neck. He tried to sit up, and a sharp, breathtaking spike of agony shot through his ribs. He gasped, falling back against the heavy silk pillows. Don't force it, Mr. Miller. Ethan turned his head carefully. Dr. Orris sat in a leather armchair by the window, a book open in his lap. The morning light filtering through the heavy blackout curtains was gray and bruised. What time is it? Ethan rasped. His throat felt like sandpaper. Just past 8, the doctor replied, closing his book. He stood and approached the bed, clicking a penlight. Follow the light, please. Good. Your pupils are reacting normally. The concussion is mild, but the bruising on your intercostal muscles will make breathing uncomfortable for a few weeks. Ethan looked down at himself. Someone, presumably a female staff member, had changed him out of his ruined clothes. He was wearing a soft, oversized gray t-shirt. His arm was secured in a clean, professional sling. Where is he? Ethan asked. Dr. Orris paused, checking his pulse. He didn't need clarification on the pronoun. Mr. Cross had business to attend to in the city. Business. Ethan knew what that meant. He closed his eyes. The memory of the bat shattering his window flashed in his mind, followed by the terrifying, suffocating silence of the men dragging him out of the car. Then, it was replaced by the memory of Julian's face in the car. I will use them to send a massacre. I need my phone, Ethan said, forcing himself to sit up, ignoring the burning in his side. I need my laptop. You need rest, Orris corrected gently. Mr. Cross left strict instructions. I don't care about his instructions. Ethan's voice gained a fraction of its usual corporate steel. Someone came after me to get to him. If they know my routine, they know my accounts. I need to secure the remote servers. Mr. Miller, please. The heavy oak door of the bedroom swung open. Julian stood in the frame. The immediate shift in the room's atmospheric pressure was palpable. He looked exhausted. His jaw was covered in dark stubble. The pristine black button-down he'd worn the night before was wrinkled, and the cuffs were unbuttoned. He looked from Dr. Orris to Ethan, taking in his rigid, upright posture and pale face. "Horace, leave us," Julian said. The doctor packed his bag without a word and slipped out, closing the door softly behind him. Julian walked to the foot of the bed. He stopped there, creating a physical boundary. He didn't ask how Ethan felt. He looked at the fresh bandages, his eyes lingering on the dark purple bruising flowering along Ethan's jawline. "You're awake," he said. "You went out," Ethan replied, his eyes dropping to Julian's hands. His right hand was resting on the carved wooden footboard. The knuckles were raw, the skin split across the middle and ring fingers. There was a faint smear of something dark and rusty near his cuff. Ethan wasn't naive. He filed the payouts for the cleanup crew. But seeing the physical evidence of Julian's brutality up close, knowing it was done because of him, sent a complicated twisting knot into his stomach. "I handle the logistics issue," Julian said smoothly, following his gaze and casually sliding his hands into his trouser pockets. "You should be lying down." "My ribs are bruised, Julian. My brain isn't broken," Ethan snapped. The painkillers were making him reckless, stripping away the professional distance he usually maintained. "I need a secure terminal. They told me to tell you the books were closed." That wasn't just a generic mob threat. They used corporate terminology. "They know what I do." Julian's jaw tightened. "I am handling it." "You're handling the street." Ethan shot back. "I handle the numbers. If there is a leak in the financial architecture, a bullet won't fix it. I need my laptop." Julian stared at him. He'd employed Ethan for 5 years. He'd seen him stare down hostile corporate auditors without blinking. He'd watched him negotiate multi-million-dollar real estate acquisitions with ice in his veins. But sitting in Julian's guest bed, bruised, battered, and wearing an oversized shirt, demanding access to a server so he could fight a mob war with a spreadsheet, it was the most formidable Julian had ever seen him. He slowly pulled an encrypted tablet from the inside pocket of his jacket and tossed it onto the mattress. It landed softly near Ethan's knee. "It's slaved to the main server in my office," Julian said. "Biometric login. You have complete access." Ethan looked at the tablet, then up at him. "Thank you." "The O'Bannons," Julian said quietly. Ethan froze. His mind instantly accessed the mental filing cabinet of the syndicate's rivals. "The Irish? They don't have the capital to launch an offensive. We bought out their last 2 legitimate shipping fronts in April. They paid for the hit vehicle using cash wrappers from the Royal Crown Casino. It's an old operation, barely profitable, but it's theirs." "That doesn't make sense," Ethan muttered, wincing as he reached for the tablet with his good arm. "They're financially starved. A direct attack on me risks a total war they can't afford to fund." "Desperation makes men stupid," Julian countered. "No." Ethan shook his head, powering on the tablet and scanning his thumbprint. "Desperation makes men predictable. Stupid is something else. If they spent capital to hire contractors to ambush me, they expect a return on investment." Julian watched him, the way his eyes darted across the screen, the fierce concentration that wiped away the vulnerability of his injuries. He felt an unfamiliar, dangerous pull in his chest. He was used to protecting assets. He wasn't used to an asset demanding to fight alongside him. "Find it, Ethan," he said softly. "Find what they think they took." By noon, the rain had stopped, leaving the estate wrapped in a thick, suffocating fog. Inside the East Wing, the silence was broken only by the rapid rhythmic tapping of Ethan's right hand on the tablet screen. He had refused to stay in bed. Against Horace's protests and Julian's silent disapproval, he'd relocated to a velvet armchair by the window, his injured arm resting on a pillow, the tablet balanced on his knees. He'd been staring at lines of code, offshore routing numbers, and shell company tax filings for 4 hours. Julian hadn't left the room. He sat at a small writing desk in the corner, reviewing physical security reports, but his attention rarely left Ethan. He was accustomed to solitude. He preferred it. But the thought of leaving Ethan alone in the room, even surrounded by 40 armed guards on the perimeter, made his skin crawl. "I need coffee," Ethan announced suddenly, breaking the quiet. Boris said no caffeine. It interferes with the muscle relaxants. Julian replied without looking up from his papers. Boris isn't trying to reverse engineer a money laundering funnel through a casino. Ethan rubbed his eyes, a sigh escaping his lips. I'm hitting a wall. The Royal Crown's legitimate books are clean. Too clean. They claim a net loss of 10% year-over-year, which justifies their tax breaks. But their operating costs don't match the depreciation of their assets. Julian closed his folder. He stood up and walked over to Ethan, pulling up a heavy wooden chair and sitting across from him. Their knees almost touched. Translate that from accountant to English, he said. Ethan shifted, acutely aware of Julian's proximity. The scent of him, rain, cold outside air, and an undercurrent of something deeply masculine and dangerous, was distracting. It means they're moving money off the books. But they aren't hiding it well. To run a ghost operation, you need a secondary ledger. I've audited our entire network. We haven't touched their accounts. We starved their shipping, yes, but we never touched the casino. We didn't need to. It's a dying dinosaur. Exactly. Julian leaned forward. So why target you? Why tell you the books are closed? Ethan stopped. His eyes widened. He furiously tapped a sequence on the screen, pulling up a massive encrypted spreadsheet. Unless what? Julian prompted, his voice low. 3 weeks ago, Ethan said, his breathing shallow. You asked me to review the acquisition of the port warehouses in the South Loop. A commercial real estate buy. I remember you finalized the escrow. I finalized the escrow. But I also audited the previous owner's tenant contracts to ensure we weren't inheriting liabilities. There was a ghost tenant. A shell company called Apex Logistics renting a defunct storage space for an exorbitant monthly fee. It looked like a classic wash operation. I voided the lease and flagged the account for closure. Julian's eyes darkened. Who owned Apex Logistics? Ethan turned the tablet around so Julian could see. I traced the LLC through 3 Delaware proxies. It dead ends at a holding company registered to a Liam O'Bannon. The silence in the room became absolute. They weren't trying to send a message about territory. Ethan whispered, the realization chilling his blood. They were using our newly acquired warehouses to wash their casino money. When I voided the lease and closed the accounts, I didn't just shut down a tenant. I severed their primary laundering artery. I trapped their liquid capital. Julian stared at the screen. The tactical map in his head instantly realigned. The O'Bannons weren't just angry. They were financially suffocating. Ethan hadn't just insulted them. He'd unknowingly put a tourniquet on their throat. How much capital? Julian asked, his tone deadly quiet. Based on the routing history. Ethan swallowed hard. Over $6 million. It's sitting in escrow limbo because I triggered a fraud hold when I closed the LLC. Julian slowly leaned back in his chair. He looked at the man sitting in front of him, bruised, battered, in pain, and utterly brilliant. He had done with a keystroke what Julian's enforcers couldn't do with guns. He had crippled a rival family, and they had tried to break him for it. They want the hold released, Julian surmised. They beat you to scare you into reversing the action. If I reverse it now, it flags the FBI, Ethan said quickly. The fraud alert is automated. The money is frozen. The only way to release it is for the holding company to verify their legitimate tax status in person, which they can't do because they're a cartel. They don't know that, Julian said. They think you're just a mob accountant holding their cash hostage. So they'll come again. Ethan looked down at his lap, his hands trembling slightly. The bravado of the last 4 hours cracked, letting the reality of the situation flood back in. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He was the target. He was the vault. Julian saw the tremor in his hands. He didn't think. He reached across the small space between them and covered Ethan's trembling hand with his large, rough one. His grip was firm, anchoring him. Ethan stopped breathing. He looked at Julian's hand, then up at his face. The cold, unreadable mask he wore for the world was gone. In his dark eyes, Ethan saw a fierce, possessive fire that terrified him almost as much as the men with the bat. They will not come again, Julian said. It wasn't a promise. It was a prophecy. Because by midnight tonight, the O'Bannon family will not have the infrastructure to hire a cab, let alone a hit squad. The war room was on the subterranean level of the estate. It didn't look like a mob hideout. It looked like a high-end corporate boardroom, soundproofed walls, a massive mahogany conference table, and a wall of digital monitors currently displaying maps of Chicago's industrial sectors. By 8 in the evening, the room was filled with men. Carter stood near the monitors. 3 other lieutenants, men with hard faces and tailored suits, sat around the table. Julian stood at the head of the table. Ethan sat to his immediate right. His presence in the room had caused a brief, palpable ripple of shock among the lieutenants. The men knew Ethan. They respected him because they feared the control he had over their paychecks. But he belonged in the penthouse office, separated from the grit and the blood. Bringing him into the bunker, injured and wearing a sling, blurred lines that had never been crossed. Julian didn't offer an explanation, which meant no one dared to ask for one. The objective is the Royal Crown Casino, Julian told the room, leaning his hands flat on the polished wood. But we are not hitting the floor. We are not touching the civilians. We are gutting the operational capacity. He gestured to Ethan. Ethan took a breath. The painkillers were wearing off, and the dull ache in his ribs was a constant reminder of why he was here. He tapped his tablet, and the main monitor shifted to display a complex organizational chart. The casino is a front, Ethan said, his voice steady, echoing slightly in the large room. Their cash on hand is low. Their liquid assets are frozen. That means they are operating on credit. They pay their security, their dock workers, and their contractors daily. Cash. He highlighted 3 locations on the map. The Royal Crown doesn't hold its cash reserves on the boat. It's a federal liability. He continued, slipping effortlessly into his element. Based on their utility payouts and security logs I pulled from the city grid, they are holding their cash in 3 off-site counting rooms disguised as payday loan fronts in Hammond. Carter let out a low whistle. She found their piggy banks. Hit the boat, they rebuild. Ethan said, looking at the men around the table. Burn the counting rooms, you destroy their liquidity. By tomorrow morning, their own men will turn on them when the daily envelopes don't arrive. You don't need to fight an army. You just have to stop paying them. The lieutenants looked from the map to Ethan, and then to Julian. The sheer ruthless efficiency of the plan was staggering. It wasn't a mob war. It was a hostile corporate takeover executed with extreme prejudice. Carter, Julian said, his eyes scanning the map. Take Team Alpha to Location 1. Sullivan, you take Location 2. I will take Location 3. Ethan's head snapped toward him. You're going? I am. That's a tactical error. He said immediately, his corporate brain overriding his survival instinct. You are the CEO. You don't do field work. If you are compromised, the entire organizational structure collapses. The room went dead silent. No one questioned Julian Cross's deployment orders. Ever. The lieutenants held their breath. Julian turned his head slowly, looking down at Ethan. His expression was unreadable. My employee was assaulted in the street. If I do not personally burn the assets of the men responsible, the street will think I have grown soft. This is not a board meeting, Mr. Miller. This is a reckoning. Ethan held his gaze. He didn't back down. And if you get shot? Then you run the numbers, calculate the loss, and pay for a very expensive funeral. Julian replied smoothly. He turned back to the men. Sync your comms. We leave in 10 minutes. Burn the cash. Seize the ledgers. Leave no one holding a weapon breathing. The men filed out rapidly, energized by the impending violence. Within minutes, the boardroom was empty, save for Julian and Ethan. The heavy silence returned. Julian walked over to a steel cabinet in the corner. He opened it, revealing a rack of tactical gear. He pulled out a dark Kevlar vest. Ethan watched him strip off his suit jacket and unbutton his dress shirt. He should have looked away, but he couldn't. Julian's torso was corded with muscle, marred by an array of pale, jagged scars. testaments to a brutal past Ethan had only ever seen the financial settlements for. A massive, intricate tattoo of a raven spread across his left pectoral, its wings wrapping over his shoulder. He pulled the Kevlar vest over his head, tightening the straps at his sides. He checked the action on a matte black Glock 19, his movements economical and practiced. "You're angry," Julian said, not looking at Ethan as he loaded a spare magazine into his belt. "I am logical," Ethan corrected, his voice tight. "Your personal involvement increases the risk profile exponentially." Julian walked back to the table. He leaned over, placing a hand on either side of Ethan's chair, trapping him. He was close enough that Ethan could feel the heat radiating from him, smell the gun oil and cedar. "I am not a CEO, Ethan," Julian said softly, his voice a dark velvet threat. "I am a monster who learned how to wear a suit. Do not confuse the two. They touched you. They made you bleed. There is no ledger in the world that balances that equation without fire." He stared into Ethan's eyes, searching for the fear he knew should be there. He wanted him to be repulsed by him. He wanted him to remember what Julian was, to maintain the firewall between them. But Ethan didn't shrink away. He looked at the scars on Julian's chest, at the gun on his hip, and finally into his eyes. "Then don't miss," Ethan whispered. A muscle feathered in Julian's jaw. For a terrifying, breathless second, he leaned in closer, his gaze dropping to Ethan's mouth. The tension between them snapped, transforming from protective rage into something feral and electric. He pulled back abruptly, breaking the spell. "Lock the bunker doors from the inside," he commanded roughly. "Do not open them for anyone but me." He turned and walked out of the room. Ethan sat in the silence, listening to the heavy steel door slide shut, his heart hammering against his bruised ribs, realizing with terrifying clarity that he was no longer just an employee. He was Julian's, and Julian was going to war for it. The Hammond storefront smelled of damp carpet and cheap bleach. The neon sign hanging in the barred window read, "Fast Cash Advance," in a flickering violet pink. Julian sat in the driver's seat of an unmarked black sedan across the street. The engine was off. The rain had started again, a steady freezing drizzle that slicked the asphalt. Through the windshield, he watched two men inside the brightly lit lobby. They weren't clerks. Clerks didn't wear tailored leather jackets that bulged at the hip, and they didn't chain smoke while staring at the front door. His earpiece cracked with a short burst of static. "Alpha is in position." "Holding," Carter's voice murmured. "Beta is set," Sullivan echoed a second later. Julian checked the luminous dial of his watch. 11:42 p.m. "Execute," Julian said. He didn't wait to hear the confirmation. He stepped out of the vehicle into the freezing rain. He didn't run. He crossed the empty street with a heavy, measured stride. He reached under his jacket, drawing the Glock. He didn't bother racking the slide. He kept a round chambered. Time was a luxury in a breach, and sound was a warning. He lifted his left arm, wrapping the heavy wool of his sleeve over his fist, and drove it through the glass door of the storefront. The tempered glass shattered with a sharp concussive crack, raining down in a cascade of glittering diamonds. Julian reached through the jagged hole, unlocked the deadbolt, and pushed the frame open. The two men in the lobby spun around, hands diving for their waistbands. Julian fired twice. He didn't aim for center mass. He didn't want a prolonged firefight. The suppressed weapon spit two dull, muffled cracks. The first man took a round in his right shoulder, the impact spinning him hard into a row of filing cabinets. The second took a round through his kneecap. He collapsed instantly, screaming, his hand dropping the pistol he'd barely managed to draw. Julian walked past them. He kicked the dropped weapon across the linoleum. He didn't look at the bleeding men. They were contractors. Grunts. The objective was behind the reinforced steel door at the back of the room. He raised his weapon and fired 3 rounds into the locking mechanism. The metal warped and smoked. Julian holstered his gun, stepped back, and delivered a devastating front kick to the handle. The door blew open, crashing against the drywall inside. The counting room was small, windowless, illuminated by harsh overhead fluorescence. There was a table in the center. On it, bundled in rubber bands and stacked like bricks, was the lifeblood of the O'Bannon Syndicate. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in small, untraceable bills. The lone man in the room, an older balding accountant with a ledger open in front of him, threw his hands in the air, his face completely drained of color. "I'm just a clerk," the man stammered, backing away from the table until his shoulders hit the wall. "I'm nobody." Julian looked at the man, then at the money. "Take your coat. Walk out the front door. If you look back, I will kill you." The man scrambled past Julian, slipping on the shattered glass in the lobby as he bolted into the rainy night. Julian was alone. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, heavy flare. He cracked the top. A blinding red chemical fire sputtered to life, hissing aggressively, filling the small room with the sharp, acrid stench of sulfur. He tossed it onto the center of the table. The bills caught instantly, the dry aged paper flaring up, a tower of green turning black in seconds. Julian stood there for a long moment, watching the empire burn. The heat washed over his face, drying the cold rain on his skin. This was the cost of touching Ethan. $1 million turning to ash for a single bruise on his jaw. He felt absolutely no regret. "Location 3 is dark," Julian said into his earpiece, turning his back on the fire. "Alpha is dark. The vault is slag," Carter reported, the sound of sirens wailing faintly in the background of the transmission. "Beta is dark. We met resistance, 3 hostiles down, but the cache is gone," Sullivan added. "Rendezvous," Julian ordered. Miles away, locked deep beneath the earth in the silent, heavily fortified bunker, Ethan heard the transmission filter through the tactical radio on the mahogany table. "Location 3 is dark." He let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for an hour. His shoulders slumped. The adrenaline that had kept him upright and focused began to drain away, leaving a cold, hollow exhaustion in its wake. He looked at the digital map on the wall monitor. The 3 red dots marking the payday loan fronts were gone. The O'Bannon family was broke. By tomorrow, they wouldn't be able to afford the gas to drive a hit squad into the city, let alone pay the men to pull the triggers. He had done this. Ethan stared at his own hands. They were pale, the nails neatly manicured. They didn't have calluses, and they didn't have blood on them. But they had typed the keystrokes that orchestrated the financial ruin of an entire criminal organization. He had drawn the map. Julian had just followed it. He waited for the guilt to hit him. He waited for the moral revulsion he assumed a normal person was supposed to feel when they crossed the line from civilian to syndicate architect. It didn't come. Instead, there was only a profound dark satisfaction. They had tried to break him. They had treated him as a weak link, a soft target to exploit, and he had dismembered them from a leather chair. He rested his head against the high back of the chair, closing his eyes. The pain in his ribs throbbed in time with his heartbeat. He was so incredibly tired. But he wouldn't sleep. He wouldn't leave the bunker. He had to see Julian walk back through that door. It was nearly 3 in the morning when the heavy locking mechanisms of the bunker door finally engaged. Ethan sat up straight, wincing as his bruised muscles protested the sudden movement. He watched the steel door slide open with a heavy pneumatic hiss. Julian walked in. He brought the smell of the outside world with him. Freezing rain, wet asphalt, the metallic tang of gun oil, and beneath it all, the harsh, unmistakable scent of chemical smoke. He was unharmed. That was the first thing Ethan's analytical mind registered. His movements were fluid, lacking the stiff compensating gait of a man hiding an injury. But he looked utterly exhausted. The brutal, vibrating energy he'd left with was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out weariness. He stopped just inside the door. He didn't speak. He looked at Ethan sitting at the head of the conference table, the glow of the monitors casting shadows over his pale face, and the stark white bandage on his temple. Slowly, Julian stripped off the wet tactical jacket, dropping it onto the floor. He unstrapped the Kevlar vest, the Velcro tearing loudly in the quiet room, and let it fall beside the jacket. He was left in his wrinkled dress shirt, the sleeves pushed up, his forearms smeared with soot and ash. He unclipped the Glock from his belt and placed it on a side table. Only then did he look back at Ethan. Ethan stood up. He did it carefully, favoring his injured side, but he refused to remain seated. "Are there casualties?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady in the large room. "None of ours." Julian's voice was gravelly, scraped raw by the cold air and smoke. "The money is gone. Their operations are entirely paralyzed. The police will find 3 burned-out storefronts. Given the neighborhoods, they'll chalk it up to local gang arson. By the time the O'Bannons figure out how to navigate the fallout, the territory will already be absorbed by the North Side crews." Julian ran a hand over his face, rubbing the dark stubble on his jaw. "It's done, Ethan." He walked slowly toward the conference table. He didn't sit in a chair. He leaned his hip against the edge of the heavy mahogany wood, right next to where Ethan was standing. He looked down at the floor, his broad shoulders rising and falling with a heavy sigh. Ethan watched him. The firewall that had existed between them for 5 years, the unwritten rule that he was the pristine, untouchable corporate face and Julian was the violent reality, was gone. It had burned up in a Hammond counting room. He stepped closer to Julian. He didn't think about the boundaries. He just reacted to the exhaustion radiating from him. "You're bleeding," Ethan noted softly. Julian looked down at his left hand. A shard of glass from the storefront door had sliced through the side of his palm. He hadn't even noticed it. A thin trail of dried blood ran down to his wrist. "It's nothing," he muttered. Ethan didn't argue. He turned, walking slowly over to the medical kit Dr. Orris had left on a side counter earlier that evening. He returned with a bottle of saline, a gauze pad, and tape. Julian watched him approach. He didn't move away. He let Ethan stand squarely in front of him. "Give me your hand," Ethan instructed. Julian hesitated. Then he lifted his left hand. Ethan took it. His grip was light, mindful of the cut, but firm. The contrast between his pale, clean fingers and Julian's large, soot-stained hand was stark. He uncapped the saline with his good hand and poured it over the cut, washing away the blood and ash. Julian didn't flinch at the sting. He wasn't looking at his hand. He was looking at Ethan's face. He studied the intense concentration in his eyes, the slight furrow of his brow, the way his hair fell around his shoulders, messy and unstyled. "You shouldn't have seen this," Julian said quietly. The words sounded like a confession, pulled from deep within his chest. "You shouldn't be down here. You belong in the glass office. You belong in the light." Ethan stopped taping the gauze. He didn't let go of Julian's hand. He looked up, meeting his dark, unreadable gaze. "The light is an illusion, Julian." His voice lacked its usual corporate polish. It was raw and deeply honest. "The glass office is funded by the blood you spill in the dark. I always knew that. I just pretended I didn't. Tonight." He paused, swallowing hard. "Tonight, I stopped pretending." "They forced you into it," Julian countered, his jaw tightening. "You acted out of survival. I won't let it happen again. Tomorrow, you can go back to the ledgers. You never have to touch this side of it again." "No." The word was soft, but it carried absolute finality. Julian's eyes narrowed slightly. "No," Ethan repeated. "I'm not going back behind the wall." He stepped an inch closer, standing directly in Julian's space. "I severed a $6 million artery tonight. I tracked their liquidity and mapped their destruction. I am not just a bystander who balances your checkbook anymore. I am part of this." Julian stared at him. He felt a dangerous, possessive thrill surge through his veins, entirely eclipsing his exhaustion. For years, he'd kept Ethan isolated, convincing himself he was protecting his purity. But looking at him now, bruised, unbroken, and demanding his place in Julian's brutal world, he realized Ethan had never needed protecting from his darkness. He was strong enough to stand in it with him. Julian slowly pulled his bandaged hand from Ethan's grasp. He lifted it, his fingers brushing against Ethan's cheek, feather-light, inches from the dark purple bruise on his jawline. "If you stay on this side of the wall, Ethan," Julian murmured, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. There is no going back. You belong to the syndicate. You belong to the street. His thumb traced the line of Ethan's cheekbone. And you belong to me. He didn't ask it as a question. He stated it as a territorial fact. He waited for Ethan to step back, to let his corporate survival instinct kick in and run from the monster. Ethan didn't run. He leaned slightly into the warmth of Julian's rough palm. His heart hammered against his battered ribs. The fear of the men in the alley was gone, entirely replaced by the terrifying, consuming gravity of the man standing in front of him. I balanced the ledgers, Julian. Ethan whispered, his eyes locked on Julian's. I know exactly what my assets are worth. And I know where they belong. Julian let out a jagged breath. He slid his hand to the back of Ethan's neck, his fingers tangling in his hair. He didn't kiss him. Not yet. He simply pulled him forward until Ethan's forehead rested against his shoulder, holding him fiercely against his chest. He closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of him, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing against Julian's ribs. The war was over. The books were closed. And for the first time in his life, Julian Cross knew exactly what he was fighting to keep. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in the silence of the bunker, the hum of the monitors the only sound. Ethan's body slowly relaxed against Julian's, the tension of the past 24 hours finally beginning to ease. Julian's hand moved in slow, soothing circles on Ethan's back, careful to avoid his injured ribs. Julian, Ethan murmured against his shoulder. What happens now? Julian was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled back just enough to look down at Ethan, his dark eyes searching his face. Now, you sleep. In my room. On my bed. Where I can see you. His voice left no room for argument. And tomorrow, we rebuild. Rebuild what? Everything. Julian's thumb brushed across Ethan's lower lip, featherlight. The organization. The city. The rules. Everything changes now. Because everything has changed. Ethan's breath caught. He knew what Julian meant. The boundaries that had kept them separate, employer and employee, alpha and omega, monster and accountant, had shattered in the cold Chicago rain. There was no going back. And for the first time, Ethan didn't want to go back. He wanted to go forward. He wanted to see what this new world looked like. Take me upstairs, Ethan said softly. Julian's eyes flickered with something dark and possessive. He didn't speak. He simply bent down, sliding one arm behind Ethan's back and the other beneath his knees, lifting him as though he weighed nothing. Ethan let out a small, surprised gasp, but didn't protest. He wrapped his good arm around Julian's neck, leaning into the solid heat of his chest. Still think you're not a liability? Julian murmured as he carried him toward the door. I think, Ethan replied, his voice thick with exhaustion and something warmer, that you're never going to let me forget this, are you? Never. The bunker door slid open, and Julian carried him up the winding staircase, through the silent halls of the manor, past the guards who respectfully averted their eyes. He brought Ethan into the master suite, a vast, masculine space with dark wood panels, a massive four-poster bed, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the fog-shrouded grounds. Julian laid him down on the bed with excruciating gentleness, as though he were made of glass. He pulled the blankets up over him, tucking the edges around Ethan's body. You're going to spoil me, Ethan murmured, his eyes already fluttering closed. Good. Julian sat down on the edge of the bed, his hand coming to rest on Ethan's hip, a warm, grounding weight. Sleep, Ethan. I'll be here. Ethan's hand found Julian's, their fingers intertwining. Promise. Julian lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to Ethan's knuckles. I promise. And for the first time in 5 years, Ethan Miller slept without fear. Dawn came slowly, a gray and bruised light filtering through the windows. Julian hadn't moved. He'd sat on the edge of the bed all night, watching Ethan sleep, his thumb stroking absently over the Omega's knuckles. The bruises on Ethan's face had darkened overnight, but his breathing was steady, his expression peaceful. Julian's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Carter. He carefully extracted his hand from Ethan's and stepped out onto the private balcony, closing the French doors behind him. "Report," he said into the phone. "The O'Bannons are in chaos," Carter said. "Their men are deserting. Word on the street is they can't pay anyone. They're sitting on a gambling boat with no cash and no future." "Good," Julian said. "There's something else." Carter's voice dropped. "Liam O'Bannon is asking for a sit-down. He wants to surrender. He says he'll hand over the casino and any remaining assets if you guarantee his family's safety." Julian was silent for a moment. The cold morning air bit at his skin. He looked back through the glass doors at Ethan, still sleeping in his bed. The Omega's dark hair fanned out against the white pillow. "Tell him I'll meet him. Neutral ground. No weapons. He brings his books. I bring my accountant." "Your accountant?" Carter sounded confused. "Boss, you don't negotiate." "Things have changed, Carter." Julian's voice was flat, brooking no argument. "Set up the meeting. And tell Liam O'Bannon that if he even looks at Ethan Miller the wrong way, I'll burn his entire family line out of existence." "Understood. Understood, boss." Julian ended the call and stepped back inside. Ethan was stirring, his eyes blinking open, unfocused and soft with sleep. "Julian." His voice was rough, disoriented. "What time is it?" "Early," Julian said, crossing back to the bed. He sat down beside him, brushing a strand of hair from Ethan's forehead. "Go back to sleep." Ethan caught his wrist, his grip surprisingly strong for someone so injured. "Where are you going?" "I have a meeting to arrange." Julian's thumb traced the inside of Ethan's wrist, feeling the flutter of his pulse. "Liam O'Bannon wants to surrender. I'm going to let him. On my terms." Ethan's eyes sharpened, the accountant in him waking up. "You're going to negotiate?" "With him. I'm going to let him kneel." Julian's voice was dark, possessive. "And I'm bringing my accountant with me. Because you're going to look at his books, find every last dollar he's hidden, and I'm going to take it all." Ethan stared at him. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his bruised face. "You're going to let me dismantle him financially. In person. I'm going to let you eviscerate him." Julian leaned down, his forehead resting against Ethan's. "And then I'm going to take you home and remind you exactly who you belong to." Ethan's breath hitched. "Julian." Julian kissed him. It was slow, deep, and devastating, a claiming that left no room for doubt. When he pulled back, Ethan was dazed, his lips parted, his cheeks flushed. "Now sleep," Julian commanded softly. "You'll need your strength for later." Ethan laughed, a breathless, disbelieving sound. "You're impossible. And you're mine." Julian pressed another kiss to his forehead. "Get used to it." By the time the sun had fully risen, Julian had already made a dozen calls, coordinated the meeting location, and ensured every possible contingency was covered. He moved through the manor with the quiet efficiency of a predator on the hunt, his mind sharp and focused. The meeting was set for that evening. Neutral Ground, a restaurant in the Loop that Julian owned through a shell company. No weapons allowed. Liam O'Bannon would come alone, or he wouldn't come at all. Ethan emerged from the master suite around noon, freshly showered, dressed in clothes Julian had ordered brought up from his townhouse. His arm was still in a sling, and the bruising on his face was vivid, but he held himself with the same quiet dignity that had always drawn Julian to him. "You look like you're about to go to war," Ethan observed, watching Julian buckle his shoulder holster. "I am." Julian shrugged on his suit jacket, adjusting the fit. "This is a different kind of war. The kind you're better at than me." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Did you just admit that I'm better at something than you?" "Don't let it go to your head." Julian walked over to him, sliding a hand around the back of his neck. "You're still my accountant. You still answer to me." Ethan leaned into the touch, a small, genuine smile curving his lips. "I always have, Julian. You just never noticed." "Oh, I noticed." Julian's thumb traced the line of Ethan's jaw, careful to avoid the bruising. "I've been noticing for 5 years. I just couldn't do anything about it. Until now." Ethan's eyes flickered with something warm and vulnerable. "What changed?" "Everything." Julian kissed him, soft and brief. "You changed. You stopped pretending to be just an employee, and I stopped pretending you were just an asset. Ethan was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he said, "So I'm not an asset anymore? You're my partner." Julian's voice was rough, raw, in every sense of the word. "You're the one person in this city I trust. The one person I'd burn it all down for." Ethan's breath caught. His hand came up to rest over Julian's heart. "That's a lot. You deserve a lot." Julian kissed his forehead. "Now come on. We have a negotiation to win." The restaurant was dimly lit, all dark wood and velvet booths. Julian sat at the center table, his back to the wall, his eyes tracking the entrance. Ethan sat beside him, close enough to touch, a tablet and a stack of printed ledgers in front of him. Liam O'Bannon arrived exactly on time. He was a tall, wiry man with the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't slept in days. He was flanked by two men, who stopped at the door when Julian's security gestured for them to wait. "Mr. Cross." Liam's voice was strained, his accent thick. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. Take a seat, Liam." Julian's voice was flat, giving nothing away. "My accountant has some questions for you." Liam's eyes flickered to Ethan, and something, recognition, resentment, flashed across his face. But he sat, folding his hands on the table like a man trying very hard to appear unarmed. "You're the one who froze my accounts," Liam said, staring at Ethan. "I'm the one who protected Mr. Cross's assets from your money laundering scheme," Ethan corrected calmly. The fraud hold was a standard, automated response. "Your only mistake was choosing a ghost tenant in a building Mr. Cross was about to acquire." Liam's jaw tightened. "You cost me $6 million. No. You cost yourself $6 million by laundering money through a shell company with no oversight." Ethan's voice was sharp, precise. "My job is to find the holes. Yours was to make sure there weren't any. You failed." Julian watched the exchange with barely concealed pride. This was the Ethan he knew, the cold, calculating accountant who could eviscerate a man with numbers and logic. "Let me make this simple, Liam," Julian said, leaning forward. "You surrender everything. The casino, the accounts, any remaining assets. You leave Chicago. Permanently. And in exchange, your family walks away. Alive." Liam's face contorted. "You're taking everything." "Yes," Julian agreed. "That's what happens when you touch what's mine." Liam's gaze flickered between Julian and Ethan, understanding dawning in his eyes. "He's not just your accountant, is he?" "No," Julian said simply. "He's not." Liam laughed bitterly, the sound scraping against the tense silence. "I thought I'd done my research. I thought hitting your weak point would force you to negotiate. I had no idea." He shook his head. "You love him." Julian didn't confirm or deny. He just stared at Liam with the dead, expressionless gaze that had made him the most feared man in Chicago. "The books," he said. "Hand them over. And walk away. This is your only chance." Liam reached into his jacket, slowly, carefully, aware of the eyes on him, and pulled out a thick folder. He placed it on the table. "Everything I have," he said. "Every account, every transaction, every shell company. It's all there." Ethan reached for the folder, his eyes already scanning the documents. His expression shifted, sharpening with focus. "This is comprehensive. He's giving us everything." "Because he has no choice," Julian said. He stood, buttoning his jacket. "Liam, you have 48 hours to leave the state. If you're still here after that, I'll assume you've changed your mind about living." "Understood." Liam nodded, his face pale. "Understood." He stood and walked out of the restaurant without looking back. Julian turned to Ethan, who was still absorbed in the ledgers. "Find anything interesting?" Ethan looked up, a slow, delighted smile spreading across his face. "He's got another $3 million stashed in an offshore account. He thought he could hide it. Can you get to it?" Ethan's smile widened. "I already have." Julian laughed, a low, genuine sound that made something warm bloom in Ethan's chest. He reached out and tugged Ethan gently to his feet, ignoring the Omega's startled protest. "Come on," Julian said. "We're done here." "Julian." You've won, Ethan. Julian cupped his face, tilting it up. You've dismantled an entire family. And now I'm going to take you home. Ethan searched his eyes, looking for the trap, the hidden agenda. He found nothing but fierce, unwavering devotion. Home, he repeated softly. Your home. Not mine. Our home. Julian kissed him, thorough and possessive. Get used to it. The drive back to the estate was quiet, the city lights blurring past the windows. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, the folder of O'Bannon assets balanced on his lap, his hand intertwined with Julian's on the center console. You know, Ethan said thoughtfully, this isn't exactly how I pictured my career going. Julian glanced at him, a faint smile curving his lips. What did you picture? Spreadsheets. Tax filings. Maybe the occasional audit. He looked down at their joined hands. Not this. Not you. Are you complaining? Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he lifted Julian's hand and pressed a kiss to his knuckles. No, I'm not complaining. Julian's grip tightened, his eyes fixed on the road. Good. Because I'm not letting you go. I know. Ethan settled back in his seat, a small, private smile on his face. I know. The manor was quiet when they returned, the staff having been dismissed for the night. Julian led Ethan upstairs, his hand resting on the small of his back, guiding him through the familiar corridors to the master suite. The room was dark except for the soft glow of the bedside lamps. Ethan stood in the center, suddenly uncertain, his good hand clutching the strap of the folder. Put the folder down, Julian said softly. Ethan complied, setting it on the dresser. He turned back to face Julian, his heart pounding. Julian crossed to him in 2 strides, his hands coming up to frame Ethan's face. You have no idea what you've done to me, do you? His voice was rough, raw. 5 years of watching you, wanting you, keeping my distance because I thought it was better for you. And then you got hurt, and I realized. He shook his head, his jaw tight. I realized I couldn't protect you by pushing you away. I could only protect you by keeping you close. Ethan's breath caught. Julian, I love you. The words came out like a confession, torn from somewhere deep. I've loved you for years, Ethan. And I was too much of a coward to say it. Ethan stared at him, his eyes wide, his heart hammering. Then he laughed, a broken, incredulous sound. You? A coward? Yes. Julian's thumb brushed over Ethan's cheekbone. Because I was afraid of losing you. Of bringing you into this world and watching it destroy you. But you're not destroyed, are you? You're stronger than any of us. I'm not strong, Ethan whispered. I'm just stubborn. Stubborn enough to save me. Julian leaned in, his forehead resting against Ethan's. Stubborn enough to stay. I'm not going anywhere, Julian. Ethan's voice was fierce, certain. You're stuck with me. For as long as you'll have me. Forever, then. Julian kissed him, deep and slow, pouring everything he couldn't say into the press of his lips. Forever. They made love slowly, carefully, mindful of Ethan's injuries. Julian touched him like he was something precious, something sacred. Each kiss, each caress a vow of protection. Ethan responded with a passion that left them both breathless, clinging to each other in the dark. Afterward, they lay tangled together, the silk sheets pooled around their hips. Ethan's head rested on Julian's chest, his fingers tracing the lines of the raven tattoo. Tell me something, Ethan murmured sleepily. Anything. What happens now? With the syndicate, I mean. Julian's hand stroked down his back, soothing and possessive. Now, we consolidate. Carter will handle the street-level operations. You'll handle the books. And I'll handle you. Ethan laughed softly. Is that how it works? That's how it works. Julian pressed a kiss to his hair. You and me, Ethan. Running the city. Making the numbers work. He paused, his voice dropping. Building a life. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he tilted his head up, meeting Julian's gaze in the dim light. I'd like that, he said softly. Building a life. With you. Julian's arms tightened around him, holding him close. Then that's what we'll do. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Ethan threw himself into the O'Bannon accounts with a fervor that impressed even Julian. He found hidden assets, exposed corrupted officials, and systematically dismantled the remnants of the O'Bannon empire. But through it all, he made time for Julian. They had dinner together every night, sharing the quiet intimacy of meals eaten without guards or surveillance. Julian learned to cook, badly, but enthusiastically, and Ethan never complained. Ethan learned to relax, to let his guard down, to trust that Julian would catch him if he fell. The first time Ethan laughed, really laughed, head thrown back, eyes bright, the sound filling the penthouse, Julian had to leave the room for a moment to collect himself. He stood in the hallway, one hand braced against the wall, breathing through the sudden swell of emotion in his chest. Julian. Ethan appeared in the doorway, concern flickering across his face. Are you okay? Julian turned to him, pulling him into his arms. I'm perfect, he murmured against Ethan's hair. You make me feel things I didn't think I was capable of. Ethan's arms wrapped around him, holding tight. That's the idea, Julian. That's the whole point. Julian held him for a long time, breathing in the scent of him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. This was what he'd been fighting for all along. Not power, not control, just this. Just Ethan. 6 months later, at a quiet ceremony in the gardens of the estate, Julian Cross knelt in front of the man he loved and asked the only question that had ever mattered. Ethan Miller, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Will you do me the honor of being my partner? For the rest of our lives. Ethan's eyes were wet with tears, but he was smiling. Yes, he said, his voice breaking. Yes, Julian. Always yes. The ring Julian slipped onto his finger was simple, a band of black titanium, with a single diamond set flush against the metal. It was a public declaration, a symbol of everything they'd built together. And as Julian kissed him, surrounded by the small group of trusted allies who had become their family, Ethan knew that this was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not in the glass office, not behind the wall, but here, in the arms of the man who had taught him that even monsters could love.